Tips to use open-ended questions. So, open-ended questions are powerful. They are a great tool in learning, in fostering critical thinking, creativity, and even in engagement. However, their effectiveness is really going to depend upon how they are used. So, here's some great practical tips, and it's going to help to maximize the impact of open-ended questions. So, first, you can align questions with the learning objectives. So, what you want to do is make sure that your questions are meaningful. They want to be closely aligned with the learning objectives for that lesson. And before you craft your question, and notice that word, craft it, right? You really want to consider your students. What do they want to learn and what do they want to achieve? What do you want them to learn and achieve? Are you aiming to deepen their understanding of a concept, to encourage critical thinking, or to stimulate some creative problem solving? Then we want to look at an example. So, if your objective is to help students understand the causes of an historical event, you might ask, what were the key factors that led to this event? How might things have unfolded differently under different circumstances? Now, think how that's going to create some more information. It's really going to generate some wonderful discussions, which is really different than if you were to say, what is the main cause of the historical event? Now you've got a really more of a close-ended question. So an open-ended question not only aligns with the learning goal, but it's going to invite students to explore multiple perspectives and to think critically. Encourage thoughtful responses. So, to elicit these thoughtful responses, you want to give students time to think, especially those introverts, right? So, avoid rushing them. Give them an opportunity that they can really ponder it first. You want to give a brief pause after you pose that question. Or maybe you want to say the question and say, think about it, or scribble down some notes for a few minutes. Then you can prompt your students to elaborate even more. If a student provides a very brief answer, ask a follow up question. Can you think more? Can you explain some more about that? Or what evidence do you have? This is going to encourage even deeper reflection and discussion. Next, create a safe and inclusive environment. So, creating this safe and inclusive environment is going to help students to engage more. They're going to feel safe. They're going to be supported in sharing their ideas. They're not going to feel as if they're being criticized. You want to make a place where all contributions are valued and all opinions are respected. To create this kind of an atmosphere, you must teach and model respect. You must listen, and you must use a dialogue that is going to be open to conversation. Encourage students to build on each other's ideas and explore different viewpoints. This not only enriches the discussion, but it also helps students to develop important communication skills. So use questions to facilitate discussions. Open-ended questions are particularly effective in class discussions. It's going to help people. So instead of using an isolated prompt, integrate the students and the questions into broader conversations that will involve multiple students. Encourage the response. Even ask them to respond to each other's answers or even their own. Ask follow-up questions and explore different angles of a topic. For example, one thing that you can do is you can say, hey, maybe in a literature class, right? How do the characters' motivations influence their actions? And then if they ask that, you could say, do you agree with that perspective? Or how might another character view that situation? This keeps the discussion really dynamic and allows the students to delve into a deeper material and deeper point of view. Next, be mindful of how you phrase that question. So, the way you phrase your question is going to significantly impact the quality of the student responses. Avoid leading questions that are going to really push toward a specific answer or limit the scope of students' thinking. Instead, frame your questions in a way that encourage exploration and multiple interpretations. For instance, you might say, why was the character wrong to make that decision? Well, that implies a decision. You don't want to make that judgment. You want to give them the opportunity to decide if they think their decision was right or wrong. So instead, you might want to say, what are possible reasons behind the character's decision, and how do you interpret their actions? You could also incorporate open ended questions into your assessments. These can be a valuable component of assessments because it'll provide insights into students' understanding and reasoning skills. Now, mind you, it's going to take a lot of time to grade those, but it's going to be well worth it in the end. So, when you're designing your assessments, include questions that require students to explain their thinking, to make connections, and to apply their knowledge. So let's look at an example. Instead of asking people to recall a fact, like when was the War of 1812, right? Instead, you're going to challenge them with a question of, so how do you apply the principles you've just learned into a real world problem? Not only will this assess their grasp of the material, but it encourages them to think creatively and critically. Encourage some self reflection and metacognition. Students have many different ways of learning and they have different strengths. So, open ended questions can be adapted to accommodate these differences. For visual learners, you may want to ask questions like, how do you interpret a graph or a diagram? For kinesthetic learners, you can pose the question that refers to a hands on experiment or an activity. So, after a science experiment, you may want to ask, based on what you observed, what conclusions can you draw? Right? Wouldn't that be wonderful? I love that one. We also want to look at how we can look at the different ways that you can now observe those questions and those answers. What kind of conclusions can you draw? And how can you design a follow up question? These type of questions are going to allow students to apply their wonderful opportunities to learn and to grow. As we move on, we want to also look at how we can use these questions to really pull out the different creative thinking styles. So if you're in a science experiment, you might want to ask those questions of what you've observed or noticing what you've observed, what conclusion have you drawn? And maybe you want to even ask the question, how would you design a follow-up experiment? Or how would you change the design of this experiment? Now let's look at balancing open-ended questions with other types of questions. So although open-ended questions are very, very valuable, we need to realize that there's some other options. You've got some closed-ended questions, and you may even have questions that are going to look upon more reflection. But we want to be able to balance our questions with the type of learning goals that we have. You want to be able to see and assess basic knowledge as well as that deeper critical skills. So, for example, in a history lesson, you might have a few closed ended questions to check a student's understanding of dates and events, but then also have open ended questions that encourage them to explore the causes and consequences of those events. Reflect on the effectiveness of your questions. So, after you've done all of this, be sure that you take the time to reflect on the open ended questions that you've created and you've used. After a lesson or discussion, you may want to go through and grade yourself. How did your students respond? Were they engaged and thoughtful? Did some questions prompt deeper things and deeper answers than others? And here's the problem. Sometimes we really need to look at it and gather feedback so that we can know how we as teachers and discussion facilitators can improve our process. As we close, you want to remember that open-ended questions are versatile and they're powerful. They offer numerous benefits for teaching and learning. Carefully crafting and using these questions creates a more dynamic and inclusive, thought-provoking classroom environment. So whether encouraging critical thinking, fostering creativity, or facilitating meaningful discussions, open-ended questions can transform the educational experience and prepare students for a lifetime of learning.